There is perhaps no tale more influential than that of the Iliad. The stories of Helen's abduction, the death of Achilles, and the sack of Troy still resonate more than 3,000 years later. Until recently, this legend was believed to be merely that, a legend, cooked up by some fanciful playwrights. The work of one man destroyed this claim, digging out from the earth the mythic city of Troy itself. As it just so happens, that man was also a pathological liar. This is the story of Heinrich Schliemann, the conman who discovered Troy. Johann Ludwig Heinrich Julius Schliemann was born on January 6, 1822, in the small North German town of Neubruckau. He was the son of a Lutheran minister, and a year after his birth his father would relocate to the nearby village of Onkershagen, a richer parish that would better provide for the needs of the Schliemann family. This village was rife with legends and mysteries that would come to dominate the imagination of the young boy. Behind his house was a pond called the Silver Bowl, from which a woman was said to rise each night holding just such an object. A barrow in town was said to hold the remains of a robber baron's child, buried there in a golden cradle. The large castle that loomed over town was filled with secret passages and tunnels, haunted by the ghost of a notorious outlaw. He was said to have buried his treasures in the castle garden before ending his own life. These stories enchanted the young Schliemann, and simultaneously brought him close to his childhood friend and first love, a girl named Mina. Whilst all his other peers simply mocked him and paid little attention to these fanciful stories, only she shared his passion for them, and the two would spend their youths entranced. Through this they grew closer, and soon the two of them would vow to marry and explore the town's mysteries once they were older. But to Schliemann, the mysteries of this small town were merely a stepping stone to his biggest fascination. His father, a man with a passion for antiquity, would pass down to his son its greatest legends. Schliemann came to adore them, and above all, the story of the Iliad. The young Schliemann championed the Trojan cause, and was dismayed to learn of the city's fate. His father insisted that the story was merely a legend, but Schliemann was adamant that this was not so, that such a great city could not possibly have been completely destroyed, and that its ruins must still exist, buried somewhere beneath the sands of time. He resolved to one day find and excavate the mythical city for himself. And thus, Schliemann's legend had begun, a young boy destined to unearth the legendary city. Unfortunately, this entire fantastical story, the mysterious town, his future betrothed, and the resolve to excavate Troy, come from Schliemann's own autobiography, written years after this supposed childhood dream had already been accomplished, and had come to define his life. At the time of its publication, these stories were mostly taken at face value, but as will soon become obvious, Schliemann cannot help but to exaggerate, or sometimes outright lie, whenever he feels that it will make his story more dramatic. Thus, this all-too-perfect story of Schliemann's childhood does not deserve to go unscrutinized. To give him at least some credit, it is not at all odd for a boy in his age to have read the Iliad, and thus to have questioned the city's fate is by no means an outlandish claim. However, it is a simple fact that there is not a single mention by Schliemann himself, to others, or even in his own personal diary, of this supposed childhood resolution to excavate Troy until 1868, well into his adult life. Thus, the natural conclusion must be that the story was either greatly exaggerated or outright fabricated, a tendency that will certainly continue. At the age of 9, Schliemann's mother passed away, and due to what Schliemann calls another misfortune, the townsfolk would turn their backs on the family, including his beloved Mina. This other misfortune that Schliemann glosses over can be attributed solely to the actions of his father. While his mother was still alive, his father had begun an affair with her personal maid, and after his mother had found out, he had not cut ties, but merely sent her away to a nearby town. Just a few months after his mother's death, the mistress was invited back to the house. The townsfolk already disliked the elder Schliemann. He was notoriously quarrelsome and violent, and he was suspected of embezzling church funds for his personal use, This action was merely the final straw. And so, the younger Schliemann was forced to suffer for the sins of his father in what he describes as the darkest part of his life. Losing Mina was 1,000 times more painful than even the death of his mother. Bathed in tears and alone, I used to stand for hours each day before Olgartha von Schroeder's portrait, remembering in my misery the happy days I had passed in Mina's company. The future appeared dark to me. All the mysterious wonders of Ankershagen, and even Troy itself, lost their interest for a time. Seeing my despondency, my father sent me for 2 years to his brother, the Reverend Frederick Schliemann. After these 2 years of study, Schliemann was enrolled in a grammar school in Neustrelitz. After his father lost his job due to the villagers' protests, he was moved to the less prestigious Realschule, not intended to transition into higher education. After graduation, he would meet with Mina one last time before becoming a grocer's apprentice in the town of Fürstenberg. According to Schliemann's autobiography, they were said to have both been speechless, bursting into tears in each other's arms until they were separated by Mina's parents. In reality, she greeted him coldly, only asking how his sisters were doing, deeply wounding the 14-year-old Schliemann. He now resolved to raise his station in life, so that one day he would be able to marry her. He would spend the next 5.5 years as a grocer's apprentice in a rather small store, working from 5 in the morning until 11 at night, and serving mostly the lowest ranks of society. He had no time to study, and whatever little he had learned was forgotten. Excluding a single event of rather dubious authenticity, this entire period was rather unremarkable. Supposedly, a young miller's apprentice came into the store one day, reciting Homeric poetry in perfect cadence, leaving a deep impression on the young Schliemann, who prayed to God for a chance to learn this beautiful language. On one unfortunate, or perhaps fortunate day, Schliemann would injure himself while lifting a heavy cask, making him unable to continue his job at the grocer's. Unwilling to return home due to the violent fights between his father and stepmother, he instead moved to Hamburg, but couldn't find long-term employment on account of his injury. Desperate, he would board a merchant ship bound for South America, where he hoped to find better prospects. But just after departure, the ship would sink near the shore of the Netherlands. Schliemann viewed this as an act of fate, and would travel to Amsterdam looking for work. Winter was setting in, and he had already sold his coat. What little money he had was spent on accommodations. After this money ran out, he feigned illness to live in the hospital. Luckily, a family friend had heard of his situation and sent him an allowance, as well as helping him to obtain a job as an office boy for the Consul General of Prussia. This was menial work, stamping and cashing bills and ferrying letters, but Schliemann was no stranger to this. Rather, he found himself much freer than he had been at the grocer's, and would use his leisure time to study English. But this cost money, and Schliemann cut corners wherever else he could to fund his education, living in a dingy attic with no fire, and eating only rye meal porridge for breakfast, with a dinner no more appealing. All his money was funneled into his studies, and in this matter, Schliemann would prove a genius. In his study of English, he developed a method that would allow him to learn more than 16 languages by the time of his passing. He would attend lessons daily, writing essays on topics of interest that were then corrected by a teacher. To practice pronunciation, he would visit an English church twice every Sunday and repeat to himself the pastor's sermon. He would memorize English books to improve his memory, and found that after 3 months of study, he could recite 20 pages of text after having read them only 3 times. He memorized the entirety of the Vicar of Wakefield and Ivanhoe, and in half a year had thoroughly mastered English. He would go on to study French, Dutch, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. Of course, it is easy to assume that this is just another one of Schliemann's wild tales, but even his most ardent critics will admit that he did indeed learn all of these languages in one way or another, and would even write with them in his diary, using the language of whatever country he happened to be in. In this matter, Schliemann's bold claims are completely vindicated. During his studies, he would seize the opportunity to change jobs, becoming a bookkeeper for a trading firm. The company had extensive trade in Russia, but no one who could speak the language. Schliemann got to work, and in 6 weeks found himself able to converse fluently with a group of Russian merchants. Sensing his value, the firm would send him to St. Petersburg as a general agent, where Schliemann thrived. After only a few months, he would form his own wholesale business, primarily in the trade of indigo. Finally having established himself, Schliemann would at once propose to his beloved Mina, but to his horror, she had already been married, plunging Schliemann into a deep depression. I fancied that neither could she be happy with anyone else besides me, nor that I could possibly ever live with another wife but her. Why then should fate be so cruel as to tear her from me when, after having for 16 long years striven to reach her, I seemed at last to have succeeded in attaining her? It had indeed happened to Mina and me, as it often happens to us in our sleep, when we dream that we are pursuing somebody and can never catch him, because as often as we reach him, he escapes us again. I thought I could never get over the misfortune of losing Mina as the partner of my life, but time, which heals all wounds, at last healed mine, so that, although I remained for years mourning for her, I could at least continue my mercantile pursuits without further interruption. Schliemann's talent for business turned out to be no less than that for languages, and he would soon become a very wealthy man. In 1848, he seems to have somewhat recovered from his heartbreak, and proposed to another woman, Sophie Hecker, who was persuaded to accept by her father, who was well aware of Schliemann's newfound wealth. Schliemann would break off this engagement after he saw her dancing happily with a young soldier. The following year, he would receive news from his brother who had moved to California, seeking his fortune in the gold rush. There, he had opened a hotel and begun to trade in real estate, but he had unfortunately caught typhoid fever and recently passed. To claim his brother's estate, Schliemann would travel to the United States. He would first visit the East Coast, where he claims to have gone to the capital and met with the president himself, although this is almost certainly not true. He would then make his way to San Francisco, where one of his strangest lies was concocted. According to Schliemann, on June 4th, he witnessed the San Francisco Fire of 1851, and describes in detail its horror on a page of his diary. Those familiar with the event are surely perplexed. The fire took place on May 4th, not June, when Schliemann was not even in the city. Upon examination of his diary, it is obvious that the entire page describing this scene was glued in, clearly having been added later. His entries for May left no suitable gap for this story, and so the date was changed to June instead. During his stay in California, Schliemann would continue to demonstrate his penchant for business, opening a bank that purchased gold dust from miners. After the annexation of California, he would apply for United States citizenship, but due to legal requirements would need to wait at least 5 years to continue his application. Of course, Schliemann claims that this was when his citizenship was obtained, trying to cover up his later underhanded method. He would also send another proposal to Sophie, but expecting her to refuse, proposed to another woman as well. As it turns out, the two women were close friends, and not at all amused by his antics. In the April of 1852, he would sell his American business and flee the country, having been accused by the Rothschild agent he had been dealing with of sending underweight shipments and pocketing the difference. When he reached the coast of Panama on his return, he discovered that the ship bound for Europe had already left, and he was stranded without food or shelter with his fellow passengers. It rained the entire time, and they resorted to eating iguanas raw for sustenance. The next ship came only 2 weeks later, bringing a weary Schliemann back to Russia. Just 2 months after his return, he would finally get married. His partner was a different woman, Ekaterina Lishina, the daughter of a business partner. He had proposed to her before this, but he was not nearly as wealthy as he had now become. This motive proved a poor foundation for a good relationship, and despite having a total of 3 children, theirs was not to be a happy one. Despite this, Schliemann returned to business, raking in massive profits during the Crimean War. To expand his business, he would study the Swedish and Polish languages. Soon after the war had ended, he would also begin to finally learn Greek. He would master the language in 6 weeks before turning to its ancient form, spending 3 months studying the classics. Of the Greek grammar, I learned only the declinations and the verbs, and never lost my precious time in studying its rules. For as I saw that boys, after being troubled and tormented for 8 years and more in schools with the tedious rules of grammar, can nevertheless none of them write a letter in ancient Greek without making hundreds of atrocious blunders. I thought the method pursued by the schoolmasters must be altogether wrong, and that a thorough knowledge of the Greek grammar could only be obtained by practice, that is to say, by the attentive reading of the prose classics, and by committing choice pieces of them to memory. Following this very simple method, I learned ancient Greek as I would have learned a living language. I can write in it with the greatest fluency on any subject I am acquainted with, and can never forget it. I am perfectly acquainted with all the grammatical rules without even knowing whether or not they are contained within the grammars. And whenever a man finds errors in my Greek, I can immediately prove that I am right, by merely reciting passages from the classics where the sentences employed by me occur. During this time, Schliemann would become thoroughly acquainted, or perhaps reacquainted, with the great classical works, particularly those of Homer, the Iliad and Odyssey, reading through them several times. He would next perform a similar feat with Latin. Thorough knowledge of these two languages was expected of an educated man in this time. He began to grow weary of his work, and would go on a great vacation traveling throughout Europe. He would then travel to Egypt and the Middle East, stopping briefly in Greece before coming down with a fever. On his return to Russia, he would pass by the Troad, the region in Anatolia where the ancient city of Troy was said to stand. In my mind's eye I saw the city, the citadel, the tents of the Achaeans and the priest Chryses who, shamed and dishonored by Agamemnon, praised to Apollo for vengeance. Schliemann would return to his work for a few more years, but this yet again grew stale, and he now planned an even grander adventure. To begin his journey, he first traveled to North Africa, but sickness caused him to temporarily return to Italy for treatment. Here he would develop a pain in his ears, and attempt sea bathing to cure it, but to no avail. He would see a German specialist, who informed him that this was exostosis, a condition causing bony growths in his ear canals. It was aggravated by the cold, particularly cold water, implicating Schliemann's sea baths, but he would continue them regardless. Eager to resume his journey, he would return to North Africa before heading to India, visiting the Himalayas and many of its great cities. In Singapore his condition returned, and a doctor in Batavia would remove the growths from his ears. Undeterred, he continued his journey, visiting China, Japan, and much of North America before returning home. Finally back, Schliemann found that his relationship had taken a turn for the worse, and began to move his assets out of the country, purchasing apartments in Paris, and would soon move there himself. Despite their troubles, Schliemann tried to convince his wife to join him. To appeal to her sensibilities, he would begin to frequent famous theaters and scholarly lectures, writing to her about his experiences, but she refused to come regardless. Knowing that she liked the city of Dresden, he proposed that they move there instead, but yet again she refused. Today is Christmas Eve in St. Petersburg. I always reckon what o'clock it is there, and with heart and soul I am continually with my little darlings, thinking how they are rejoicing at their Christmas tree, and shedding bitter tears that I cannot contribute to their cheerfulness by my presence. $100,000 I would give if I could spend this evening with them. Indeed, much more philosophy and fortitude than I have are required to pass this day without being bathed in tears. Schliemann continued to attend the scholarly classes, but rather than as motivation for his wife, it was now out of a genuine interest. According to his critics, it is much more likely that this is when he would first truly become acquainted with the field of archaeology. On a trip to Italy, he showed a much greater interest in historical museums and monuments, gazing in awe at the ongoing excavation at the Palatine Hill. In an art museum, he found himself particularly enamored by a painting of Cleopatra's banquet, at which Mark Antony famously cast a pearl in her goblet, proclaiming that she only loved him because he was rich. He would go on to visit Naples, Pompeii, and Herculaneum. At Corfu, he waded across a river to find the spot where Nausicaa met Odysseus. After this, he would also climb Mount Athos, coming to the ruins of a large structure. At the northern part of the castle, 2 walls of large stones run down, which end in a kind of tower. For a long time I sat in the ruins of the palace, reading the Divine Odyssey, and in particular, the recognition scene of Odysseus and Penelope, and wept profusely. There is a superb view from the summit. Nowhere in the world is the sea so clear and the mountains so beautiful as in Greece. Now convinced that this must be the site of Odysseus's palace, he resolved to return with the proper equipment for excavations. He would soon do just that, bringing a worker with a digging fork and pickaxe. Schliemann claims to have found some clay vessels and sword fragments, although it should be noted that this find is suspiciously similar to a list of artifacts that he had purchased as souvenirs. In Athens, he would meet with the architect Ernst Ziller, who was present during the first archaeological excavation searching for ancient Troy, and this was no doubt the subject of their conversation. Viewing his life through a critical lens, it is from this point that Schliemann's interest in digging for Troy truly seems to have originated, and from then on the concept would enthrall him. After some additional sightseeing in Greece, he would head directly for the Troad. In this time, scholarly opinion on the subject of Troy was divided. On one side, there were those who believed that the city was purely mythological, and on the other, those who believed it was a real city. Of those who held this latter opinion, most believed that the ancient city was buried near the village of Bunarbashi, and this was where the first dig had taken place. A small minority favored the town of Hisarlik to the north. Thus, Schliemann headed to Bunarbashi to investigate for himself, but was somewhat disillusioned. According to Homer, the city should have 2 springs that sent forth hot and cold water, but Bunarbashi had 34, all relatively cool. The layout of the hilltop itself also did not seem to line up. I left my guide with the horse at the top, and I went down the precipice, which inclines at first at an angle of 45 degrees, and then at an angle of about 65 degrees, so that I was forced to go down on all fours. It took me almost 15 minutes to get down, and I came away convinced that no mortal, not even a goat, was able to run down a slope of 65 degrees, and that Homer, always so precise in his topography, could not have wanted us to believe that Hector and Achilles ran down this impossible slope 3 times. Despite his misgivings, he would hire some workmen to make a preliminary excavation. He came away largely empty-handed, besides finding a small fort that he claimed was the ancient city of Gergis. For now, he would abandon the site, and spend some time traveling around the Troad. According to Schliemann, he would discover the site of Hisarlik close by, and was quickly convinced that this was the true site of Troy rather than Bunarbashi. To celebrate his discovery, he would order a chicken dinner, but the bird made an escape before it could be roasted. With a soft spot for animals, Schliemann told the chef to leave it be, and to prepare a different meal. Before he returned home, Schliemann would meet with the archaeologist Frank Calvert, who was happy to show Schliemann his collection of antiques. He too was convinced that Hisarlik was the site of Troy, and had already purchased a significant portion of the site and made some preliminary excavations. According to Schliemann, he was glad to have met with someone who agreed with his deduction. But yet again, Schliemann's retelling of events does not seem to match up to reality. While he had indeed visited Hisarlik, and even seen Calvert's excavation, at the time he made very little note of it. It is only after this meeting with Calvert that he would suddenly adopt the theory. Regardless, Schliemann was now thoroughly convinced, and returned home to make preparations for an excavation. But these plans would have to wait, as Schliemann was distracted by further marital troubles. On Christmas Eve, he would make an attempt to meet with his wife, but she had taken the children and left the house. "You had gone out precisely because you knew that your poor husband would come. I had gone to see you with the intention of staying with you at least a week, and of restoring good harmony between us at any price. In fact, I swear in the name of God Omnipotent, that I was then prepared to make all possible concessions, and that I was ready to sacrifice even 1,000,000 francs to restore domestic peace. But how did you act towards me? The hair bristles on my head with dismay and horror, when I merely think of your infernal conduct. Not knowing how to torment me further, you reproached me cruelly for having refused to buy snuff in 1852, and for being unwilling in 1855 to buy a carriage. You certainly did not hear from me a single bad word, even when your terrible and execrable conduct had destroyed my heart. And you will recall that when, in a fit of anger, I went out the door, I shouted that your monstrous behavior would never debase my character, whose greatness you will see in all my actions, and after my death you will bless the memory of your benefactor, whom you have only vilified during his life." This was the final straw, and Schliemann now made plans to get a divorce. At the time, the state of Indiana was known for its lax divorce laws, and so Schliemann returned to the United States, where he encountered a serious roadblock. To complete his citizenship and file for divorce, he would need proof that he had lived in the United States for at least the previous 5 years, and in Indiana for at least 1 year, which Schliemann clearly had not. As this proof was usually presented in the form of a witness testimony, the wealthy Schliemann was somehow able to obtain it, and his divorce would soon be granted. Before leaving America, he would write to his tutor of Greek, asking him for help in finding a new, Greek wife. Whilst studying with him, Schliemann had remarked on the angelic character of his tutor's mother and sister, in sharp contrast to his wicked wife. Primarily, he wanted to marry someone that shared his interest in ancient Greek literature and philology, and who was just as obsessed with scholarship as him. He would soon receive a series of photographs of potential candidates, but did not take to any of them. The one that did interest him, Sophia in Gastromenos, was only 17, much too young for a man of 47, and Schliemann replied that he would much prefer a widow in his same stage of life. The very next day, he changed his mind and announced that he had fallen in love with Sophia and would not marry anyone else. They would be married that very same year. With these personal matters finally settled, Schliemann could once again return to Troy and cement his legacy. The plain is covered with the beautiful green of spring, and embroidered with millions of flowers. Numerous herds of sheep and cattle are to be seen, and also many horses and countless storks moving with slow, measured steps. The view is further varied with the fine oaks to be seen here and there in the plain. Beyond the plain, at a distance of 3 miles, is the beautiful Hellespont, where ships are constantly to be seen. On April 9th, 1870, Schliemann would begin his excavation, making plans to dig near the summit. This land was not owned by Calvert, and its Turkish owners were unlikely to give permission to excavate, so Schliemann simply didn't bother asking. This initial dig was greatly disappointing. He found none of the beautiful buildings and artifacts he had expected. A nearby ridge was slightly more rewarding, yielding some fragments of pottery, statues, and coins, as well as the ruins of a temple that Schliemann believed was from the Greek period. Even this first dig is exemplary of the dishonesty that would continue throughout Schliemann's career, twisting the truth for the sake of dramatic effect. When publishing his findings, he claimed that he found the structure, as well as many of the nicer artifacts, on the summit instead of on the ridge. And as he claimed that the ruins sat on the summit, Schliemann suggested that it was probably the alien Minerva temple mentioned in the Iliad. Ironically, there was a kernel of truth to this, as archaeologists identify this structure as indeed having been part of the legendary Troy, rather than a later Greek addition as Schliemann believed. Having been met with success, Schliemann asked Calvert to purchase the rest of this site. It should be much cheaper after the pasture had been ruined by his digging. The irate owners refused to sell, having been cursed out by Schliemann when they came to stop him. He would return to Paris, where he got into a heated argument with his wife, who had been constantly studying under his coercion and had begun feeling homesick. "Since your behavior towards me has brought me to the extreme point of distress, I am also fully prepared to do all in my power to help you get a divorce with all speed. Although I have never done you any wrong, even in a dream, I will with pleasure sign that I am guilty of murder, piracy, adultery, and any other crime. In any case, with this letter I swear 1,000 oaths that I cannot and will not live any more with you, not even for a day. If I were to give myself 1,000,000 francs a day, I am no longer capable of living even a day with you, because you are killing me with your behavior towards me. For this reason, please abandon any idea of coming back with me. Rather than putting up with you beside me for one more day, I would do 1,000 times better if I took my own life." He would apologize 3 weeks later, and agree to make Athens their permanent home. The next year, she would give birth to a daughter, named by the pair Andromache after the Trojan princess. Just after his daughter's birth, Schliemann would receive official permission from the Turkish government for his excavation, who had already acquired the land, and so he would return to the city to resume his work. There exists a saying that Troy was sacked twice, once by the Greeks, and once by Heinrich Schliemann, and unfortunately, this is not at all an unfounded claim. Schliemann was initially convinced that Troy, being an ancient city, must lie at the very bottom of the site, and set to work removing anything obstructing this layer. Since the fall of the city, there had been further Greek and Roman additions on top. These were all cleared away by Schliemann with reckless disregard. Perhaps most unfortunately, he was completely mistaken about the real layer of Troy. While he initially believed that it was on the lowest layer, after discovering a multitude of bronze tools and weapons on the second layer, he reasoned that it, now dubbed Troy II, was likely the ruins of the mythic city. In fact, both claims were wrong, and in reality Troy VI, one of the layers that was wantonly destroyed, is where the true city resided. The dig was not an easy one, as workers found themselves under assault by venomous snakes and centipedes, slowing the work to a crawl. Schliemann became a sort of unofficial doctor, urging his workers not to smoke, prescribing quinine, and extolling the virtues of exercise, fresh fruit, and sea bathing. He claims to have healed a woman too weak to walk and covered in ulcers by giving her castor oil and a new dress while having her follow this regime. In late June, he would work with Calvert to dig the section he owned, agreeing to split the findings. The most significant of these, the Ilios metope, would create a rift between the two, as unwilling to split it in half, Schliemann offered to buy Calvert's share. Calvert estimated a worth of £240, but would agree to receive £125. Schliemann, however, insisted that it could be worth no more than £40. He eventually agreed to pay Calvert £50 if he covered its transportation. Much to Calvert's fury, he would later learn that Schliemann had valued the metope at £6,000, and even its real value, around £1,000, was more than 10 times the price Schliemann had sworn was the highest he could get. Perhaps seeing little chance of winning, Calvert declined to take Schliemann to court. After a brutal winter, excavations would resume the following year. This would be Schliemann's best, as he would discover what he dubbed Priam's treasure. According to Schliemann, he was digging into a wall when he spotted a glint of gold. He called over Sophia, and together they discovered thousands of beautiful artifacts: helmets, swords, vases, jewelry, and more than 8,000 gold rings. Sophia was said to have carried the artifacts back to their quarters in her red shawl. Schliemann claimed that this was the treasure of Priam, the king of Troy, who had hidden these valuables when the Greeks invaded. As per usual, this story is filled with Schliemann's typical lies and exaggeration. Sophia was in Athens when the find was made. Schliemann would later tell a friend that the story was invented to encourage her interest in archaeology. More concerning, however, were the contents of the treasure itself, as Schliemann had in fact combined many different previous finds to create one that appeared as lavish as possible. Regardless, after this great discovery, Schliemann ended his excavation. According to the terms of his agreement, half of the treasures that Schliemann had found at Hisarlik were meant to belong to the Turkish government, but unwilling to give it up, Schliemann had the treasure smuggled out of the country into Greece. Initially, he made plans to produce fakes to present instead, but after learning that the Greek government was unlikely to get involved in a dispute between two foreign parties, he decided not to bother and published his findings. This would cause quite a stir, as archaeologists were forced to acknowledge that not only did Troy really exist, but Schliemann had unearthed it at Hisarlik, something they would have previously believed to be unthinkable. He did, however, come under some criticism. Many thought it simply absurd to refer to the treasure as Priam's. Professor Max Müller retorted that it was like looking for the treasure of the Nibelunge at Worms. Even Calvert himself weighed in on the matter. Whilst fully recognizing his enterprise, devotion, and energy in carrying out these excavations, I cannot help but express the regret that Dr. Schliemann should have allowed the enthusiasm which, as he himself admits, borders on fanaticism, to make it so paramount an object with him to discover the Troy described by Homer, as to induce him to suppress or pervert every fact brought to light that could not be reconciled with the Iliad. Schliemann, however, did not take well to this criticism. The chief or king at the time of Troy's tragic end is called Priamos by Homer and by tradition, and for that reason I will call him by the same name, and shall continue to do so until Professor Max Mueller proves to me that he had another name. In the same way, I shall continue to call the last Trojan king's treasure Priam's treasure until the professor proves that the Homeric Ilium's last monarch had a different name. Schliemann would soon be met with a much bigger problem, as he was completely mistaken about the likelihood of a lawsuit. The Turkish government had already brought the matter to court, and the Greeks ordered the treasure confiscated until the matter had been settled. When they came to collect it, they discovered that it had vanished. Schliemann had likely hidden it among the various members of his wife's family. The police interrogated Schliemann, and even began to freeze his accounts, but he would never admit to anything. Eventually, the Turkish government relented, demanding instead 50,000 francs as recompense. Schliemann sent 5 times that amount, as well as various artifacts he deemed less valuable, once more ingratiating himself with the Turkish government. Now that this lawsuit was over, it was time to launch his next expedition. He would dig for the graves of Mycenae. His first request for permission was refused, and so to win the government's favor, he would fund the destruction of the Frankish tower that sat in the center of the Acropolis. Permission was eventually granted, but rightfully wary, Schliemann would not be allowed to keep any of the treasure. Furthermore, the dig was only on behalf of the Greek Archaeological Society, and they would send one of their own, Panayotis Stamatakis, to watch over the excavation. The two quickly found themselves bitter rivals. Mr. Schliemann, from the very beginning of the excavations, has shown a tendency to destroy, against my wishes, everything Greek or Roman, in order that only what he identifies as Pelasgian houses and tombs remain and be preserved. Whenever potsherds of the Greek and Roman period are uncovered, he treats them with disgust. If in the course of the work they fall into his hands, he throws them away. We, however, collect everything, what he calls Pelasgian, and Greek and Roman pieces. Despite these troubles, this excavation would turn out to be one of Schliemann's most significant, rivaling even that of Troy itself. They would discover a total of 5 graves containing beautiful bronze swords and daggers, precious metals, and a set of golden death masks. One of these, worn by a warrior in his prime, was dubbed by Schliemann the Mask of Agamemnon, and he declared that these were surely the graves of Agamemnon, Cassandra, Eurymedon, and their companions, slain by Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. Unfortunately, these graves are 300 years too early for this to be the case. Before the dig was over, the site was visited by Dom Pedro II of Brazil, its final monarch, and the anthropologist Arthur de Gobineau, who describes Schliemann as an impudent charlatan, a liar, and an imbecile. Soon after publishing his findings at Mycenae, Sophia would give birth to a son named Agamemnon, and Schliemann would have a house built for his family in Athens. He called this the Iliou Melathron, the Palace of Troy, and it was decorated exactly as this name would indicate. The floors bore mosaics based on Schliemann's findings, and on the walls were paintings in the style of Pompeii, as well as ancient Greek aphorisms such as, "Know the right moment," and "Nothing to excess." Today, his palace is home to the Numismatic Museum of Athens. In the final few years of his life, Schliemann would continue his work as an archaeologist, excavating many significant sites, such as Ithaca, Orchomenos, Thermopylae, Marathon, and Turin's. Here, he would come into contact with Rudolf Virchow and Wilhelm Dorpfeld, fellow Germans with a similar interest in archaeology. Under their guidance, his archaeological techniques began to somewhat improve, learning to excavate slowly from the top down, clearing one stratum at a time rather than digging a trench, and finally documenting and taking pictures of these layers before clearing them away. At the beginning of 1890, Schliemann would use this newfound experience to conduct one last dig at Troy. This was brought on by the theory of Ernst Bottcher, a particularly persistent critic, who insisted that Schliemann's Troy was not a city at all, but merely a large crematorium. Despite this theory having no real adherents besides Bottcher himself, Schliemann took it very seriously, and invited delegates from Germany, France, and Austria to oversee his work and prove him correct. The excavation made much slower progress this time, mostly due to Schliemann's improved technique, but he was quickly vindicated. The excavation was halted for Easter, and Schliemann would travel with Virchow to Mount Ida, searching for the place that Paris made his famous judgment. While climbing the mountain, the pair were hit by a violent storm in freezing weather, and soon after Schliemann's hearing loss would return. Virchow, primarily a doctor, would examine Schliemann's ears and reveal that his exostosis had returned and was blocking his ear canal, which would take a serious operation to remove. Not wanting the surgery to interrupt his excavation, Schliemann decided to wait, hoping that it would recede with treatment. Whether this treatment involved sea bathing is unclear, but it seems to have worked, at least temporarily, and the excavations continued. In a sense, this excavation would prove to be Schliemann's most challenging, as it began to undermine his entire magnum opus. Dorpfeld had naturally come along, and due to the presence of Mycenaean pottery, he had become convinced that Troy 6, rather than Troy 2, was the true Homeric Troy. Reluctantly, Schliemann himself would slowly begin to agree. Soon, they would unearth the season's greatest discovery, while paltry compared to Priam's treasure, the find of 4 nephrite axes, as well as various crystal and gold trinkets, was certainly nothing to scoff at. Filled with deep emotion, I threw myself on my face, and humbly kissed the heels of the goddess Fortuna, imploring her fervently for her future favor, and thanking her with all my heart for her blessings hitherto. Even the manner in which the treasure was found, in a remote spot where only a single workman was working, showed the sweet goddess's great benevolence. In typical fashion, Schliemann would later manage to smuggle these treasures out of the country. At the end of July, he would close the expedition and return to Athens. Having been staying in Vienna, his wife and children would only return in November. 2 days later, Schliemann would travel to Germany for surgery, having once more gone deaf. The growths were removed, but Schliemann still complained of a foul smell and sharp pain in his left ear, which by December had only gotten worse. Not only is it difficult for me to talk, but I am also beginning to have stabbing pains in my ear. Hence, I cannot receive or visit friends, or participate in social intercourse. Somehow or other, I have to put an end to this distressing way of life, but their orders are that I should stay here till they stop the burning and pain in my ear. But I can't bear the loneliness any longer, so I have decided to go on Friday, the day after tomorrow, to Leipzig, and on the following day to Berlin. From there I hope to proceed to Paris on Sunday, 14th December. I don't think it will do me any harm, for I will see to it that I don't catch cold. Thus, Schliemann escaped without his doctor's permission, planning to return to Athens to join his family for Christmas. He would stop in Berlin to meet with Virchow, and they would plan a future trip to the Canaries, which some scholars claimed were the Fortunate Isles of antiquity. He would continue on to Naples, intending to take a ship from there to Piraeus. Despite his condition, he would spend his days wandering around the city, visiting, for example, the German zoological station to see its new exhibits. On the morning of December 25th, he would collapse on his daily walk, and was brought back to his hotel unconscious. He was pronounced dead the following day. Schliemann's body was brought to the Ilios Malathron while his funeral was prepared. The casket was placed next to a bust of Homer, and copies of the Iliad and Odyssey were placed inside. He was entombed under a beautiful monument of white marble built in the classical Greek style, the plans created by Schliemann himself. Friezes depict various scenes of Greek mythology, as well as Schliemann's own excavations. Carved on the monument is the Greek couplet, "I cover Heinrich Schliemann of great renown. You should imitate him, he labored hard for mortals," and the words Schliemann the hero are carved above a bust of his face. At his funeral, Wilhelm Dorpfeld gave a much simpler farewell. "Rest in peace. You have done enough." To this day, Schliemann remains an enigmatic figure. Even without his wild claims, the simple fact that a poor pastor's son working as a grocer became a wealthy magnate, learned 16 foreign languages, and discovered Troy itself, becoming the father of pre-Hellenic archaeology, seems remarkable enough. There can be little argument that in his life, Schliemann was prone to exaggeration and falsehood, and his wanton destruction of archaeological sites no doubt served as a terrible setback to our understanding of the past. However, Schliemann still cannot be said to be wholly reprehensible. While his methods of archaeology are certainly barbaric to modern sensibilities, it is equally true that the field itself was still in its infancy when Schliemann got involved, and while he certainly was much more careless than many of his peers, he received little criticism for this in his day. His stretching of the truth for the sake of romanticism, while certainly deplorable from an academic standpoint, at the same time enthralled the public in his excavation, thereby greatly increasing interest in the entire field of archaeology. Virchow himself has this to say: "It may be that his hypotheses were too bold, nay arbitrary, that the enchanting picture of Homer's immortal poetry proved somewhat of a snare to his fancy, but this fault of imagination, if I may call it so, nevertheless involved the secret of his success. Who would have undertaken such great works, continued through so many years, have spent such a large means out of his own fortune, have dug through layers of debris heaped one on the other in a series that seemed almost endless, except a man who was penetrated with an enthusiastic conviction? The burnt city would still have lain to this day hidden in the earth, had not imagination guided the spade." If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like, and subscribe to see my future content. If you found it interesting, you may also enjoy my video on Ponce de Leon and his search for the Fountain of Youth. As always, thanks for watching.